Imagine a night so silent, you can hear the crackle of frost forming on your eyelashes, a lake so still. Its surface mirrors the stars like polished obsidian. Now imagine that lake suddenly begins to pulse with light, not from above, but from beneath, shifting, humming, and expanding like a second heartbeat under the earth. One by one, the laws of physics start to misbehave. And then, just as fast as it began, everything disappears, including them. Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends or closest family members to help spread awareness and caution through storytelling. May you receive great rewards for subscribe, like, comment, and share this story. Now, let's continue with the story. The last known photograph showed 7 students smiling in the bitter wind, their jackets half-zipped and breath misting in the air, with the snow-covered ridges of the Kamardabin Range stretching behind them. Taken just 2 days before the group vanished, the image would become a symbol of everything investigators failed to understand. It began as a research expedition. Organized by the Meteorological Department of Irkutsk University, the team, 3 women, 4 men, all in their early 20s, was assigned to install an experimental barometric system near Lake Goryachiy, a geologically active glacial basin surrounded by quartz-veined cliffs and dense taiga. Their goal was to record sudden atmospheric fluctuations that had been reported sporadically by forestry workers for decades, but never officially documented. They departed on January 21st, 1994, from the village of Murino. Locals helped them load the sleds and wished them luck. Although one older hunter muttered something peculiar before they left, that lake doesn't sleep in winter. Contact was expected every 48 hours via shortwave signal. After 4 days of silence, the university contacted regional authorities. A rescue team, mostly composed of local volunteers and former Soviet military, was flown in under worsening weather. They found the base camp quickly. Oddly, there were no signs of a struggle. The tents were still staked to the frozen ground. Thermal gear was neatly stored. Cooking pots rested undisturbed in snow-crusted ash. But the camp was empty. Footprints led away from the tents. 7 sets, spaced calmly, not as if fleeing, but walking, as though drawn by something. The trail ended near a ridge that overlooked Lake Goryachiy. A half-day later, the team located 2 bodies at the bottom of the ridge. Both had stripped off their boots. One was found lying flat on the snow, her arms folded neatly over her chest. The other lay curled against a tree, as if hiding from something that had no face. Their fingers were blackened from exposure, but what disturbed the rescuers most was the texture of their skin. It shimmered faintly under ultraviolet light, like chemical frost. One had streaks of hardened mucus frozen to her chin, crystallized in an unnatural spiral. Their radio equipment, recovered from the ridge nearby, was warped and cracked as if exposed to sudden intense heat. A Geiger counter brought to the scene clicked steadily, not spiking wildly, but humming at a consistent level far above the natural background radiation of the area. Authorities cordoned off the area and released a brief statement. Exposure, hypothermia, misadventure. Nothing more. But those who were there, the searchers, the families, even the helicopter pilots, knew there was more than cold and snow involved. Back in Murino, villagers spoke of what they saw that same night. A great dome of white light hovering above the lake, perfectly still, crackling like a down power line. They said it pulsed 3 times before vanishing with no sound at all. The families were not allowed to view the recovered bodies. The surviving photos were sealed. The tapes from the shortwave monitor in Irkutsk were confiscated. Only whispers remain. And one man, Sergei Antonov, a retired military technician who led the search, never spoke publicly. But in his private notes, found years later by his daughter, he wrote a single sentence beneath a sketch of the lake and its surrounding cliffs. It wasn't the cold that took them. It was the sound beneath the snow. By the time the official search was concluded, only 2 bodies had been recovered. The remaining 5 members of the Irkutsk expedition were declared lost to the elements. But in truth, the search team had not stopped because of snowstorms or treacherous terrain. They had stopped because of something else, something they could not explain. Sergei Antonov, the retired military technician who led the second search phase, had been part of numerous recovery operations during his service. He thought he had seen everything the Siberian wilderness could offer. But nothing prepared him for what they found 2 days after recovering the first 2 bodies. Just before dawn on January 30th, Sergei and a pair of volunteers stumbled upon a strange cavity in the snow along the lake's northern rim. At first glance, it appeared to be the collapsed roof of an old animal den. But as they approached, they realized the snow hadn't fallen inward. It had been melted from below. The opening was smooth, glassy, perfectly circular, and radiated a residual warmth that had no business existing in the minus 35-degree temperatures. Inside, buried beneath thin layers of melted and refrozen slush, were the remains of 2 more team members. One had his hands clamped over his ears, mouth open in a silent scream. His eardrums were ruptured. The skin around his jaw was discolored, with spiraling, fractal burns trailing down his neck. Patterns Sergei recognized from reports on microwave weapon testing during his time in the military. The other lay prone as if sleeping, but his spine was arched unnaturally and his eyes had turned completely opaque, a milky white that glowed slightly in darkness. The site was photographed, marked, then quickly covered again by new snowfall. No official from the regional office came to document it. Instead, they received a radio order: withdraw immediately and destroy the photographic film. Sergei didn't comply. He buried the film in a plastic container beneath the roots of a birch tree on the ridge. It would stay there for nearly 20 years. Meanwhile, in Irkutsk, the meteorological department quietly erased the expedition's public records. The students were memorialized as victims of a tragic weather accident. The site was closed to further study, and Lake Goryachiy was removed from all new survey maps. But some refused to forget. Natalia Grivko, the sister of one of the missing students, never accepted the official explanation. A geology student herself at the time, she knew her brother's team was equipped, cautious, and deeply familiar with the terrain. After the search was called off, she began her own investigation, slowly collecting witness accounts, old search team notes, and radio logs leaked by sympathetic university staff. What she found disturbed her. According to one partial logbook entry, captured the night of January 27th, the team had recorded increasing harmonic pulses in the 7 to 12 hertz range. These pulses were powerful enough to scramble watches and audio gear, but did not register on magnetic or seismic monitors. The final entry simply read, "The snow is singing again. Louder this time. We can feel it in our teeth." Natalia visited Murino that spring. Most villagers refused to speak with her. Those who did told her to leave the lake alone. One woman, a former ranger, spoke only under the promise of anonymity. She recalled seeing lights from her watchtower the night of the incident, 3 flickers, low and wide, that cast no shadow and moved like a ripple beneath the ice. The woman paused, then whispered something Natalia would never forget. It looked like the lake was breathing. Natalia would spend the next decade trying to understand what could make the land itself emit sound waves capable of rupturing blood vessels and boiling electronic components. Every lead pointed back to the same theory: piezoelectric resonance from stressed quartz deposits in the granite shelf beneath Lake Goryachiy. Under the right pressure, such rock formations could generate powerful electromagnetic surges. But nothing explained the organized patterns, the circular melt, the harmonic hum that matched no known natural phenomenon. And then came the final clue, an audio file. Corrupted, fragmented, recovered from the shortwave base archive by a sympathetic technician who sent it to her anonymously in 2004. Natalia played it. At first, it was only static. Then, underneath, something emerged, tones in a precise rising sequence, spaced evenly and climbing higher. After 30 seconds, they stopped. And for 2 seconds, there was the sound of breathing. Not one person. Not 7. Something else. Something vast. Natalia Grivko listened to the distorted audio dozens of times. She slowed it down. She reversed it. She filtered out the static. The rising harmonic pulses were undeniably artificial in structure. Almost musical, almost biological. It was as if the mountain had developed lungs and was exhaling through the frequencies of the earth itself. The breath at the end of the recording was not raspy or panicked. It was slow, deep, deliberate. She was certain this sound had never come from any of the students, and it didn't match known animal vocalizations or atmospheric interference either. She sent the file to an audio forensics expert in Finland who initially thought it was a hoax. But when he ran a frequency analysis, something unnerving emerged. There were 7 identical pulses, each lasting 4.2 seconds, evenly spaced, followed by a silence that contained no background noise at all. A silence so perfect, it suggested active sound cancellation. That file, dated January 27th, was the last known transmission from the Goryachiy expedition. Natalia now believed what had happened was no ordinary natural anomaly. She returned to Murino once again in late 2005, accompanied by a documentary team from Novosibirsk who had taken an interest in her research. Though most locals still kept their distance, an old hunter named Archivist agreed to speak on camera, under one condition. They must leave the village immediately afterward. Archivist described the night of the disappearance in detail. He had been out tracking boar along the frozen valley when he saw lights over the lake. But these weren't beams or flares. They were orbs, 3 large ones moving in formation above the water, and 4 smaller ones flickering along the ridge where the students' camp was located. They moved rhythmically, almost pulsing. But what shook him most was the stillness. The forest stopped, he said. No owls, no wind. Even the snowflakes stopped falling. Then he heard it. A tone not loud but piercing. It vibrated through his chest and made his skin feel like it was crawling from the inside. He dropped his rifle and began to cry. Not from fear, he said, but from a strange sorrow that wasn't his own. The crew asked him what he believed the lights were. They weren't from above, Archivist said, tapping the ground with his boot. They came from inside. Natalia returned to the site in winter 2006. She brought with her a seismograph, magnetic flux detectors, and 2 custom hydrophones lowered into the lake through hand-drilled ice holes. For 3 nights, nothing happened. On the 4th, just past midnight, the seismograph detected a short, low tremor, too localized for tectonic activity. Simultaneously, the hydrophones picked up something else. Rhythmic pressure pulses, 7 of them, then static, then a faint vibration on the ice, strong enough to knock snow from the surrounding branches. The air thickened, though there was no fog. Her breath came faster. The handheld compass spun once, paused, and froze, pointing directly beneath her feet. She packed up immediately, left everything else behind. When Natalia returned to Irkutsk, she analyzed the data in secret. The pulses captured on the hydrophones were nearly identical to the 1994 shortwave signal. But this time, they were stronger, clearer, as if whatever had sent the first message was now listening back. She now believed the 7 signals were not just coincidence. They corresponded to the number of people in the expedition. And now, with her on site, the pattern had repeated. The implication was horrifying. What if the anomaly wasn't random? What if it was responsive? She kept her findings to herself. The documentary was never released. The production company claimed technical errors corrupted all footage. 2 members of the crew refused to speak about what happened on the ice. One moved to Kaliningrad. The other vanished from public life entirely. Only Natalia continued, because deep inside she knew what she had touched wasn't just geological or electrical or magnetic. It was aware. It had patterns. It had memory. And worse, it might not be done yet. In the months following her final visit to Lake Goryachiy, Natalia became consumed with pattern recognition. She no longer viewed the signals as simple geophysical noise. She was convinced they represented a structure, not architectural, but rhythmic, musical, perhaps even a kind of intelligence. She began to refer to the pulses as resonant markers, like footsteps left in the snow by something that didn't walk. She rented a small room near the edge of Irkutsk and withdrew from university life. Her research became obsessive. She built models of the terrain, plotted signal timings against the positions of celestial objects, and layered seismic anomalies over archival maps from the Soviet Geodetic Service. The results were disquieting. The signals formed a grid, an uneven but deliberate alignment of 7 nodal points across the lake basin. Each matched locations where the students were believed to have either camped, passed through, or were later found. The seventh point had never been reached. Natalia called it Node 7. According to satellite overlays and terrain data, Node 7 lay beneath the deepest part of the lake, where the bedrock dropped into an unexpected and unmapped chasm. This trench, roughly oval in shape, did not appear in any previous geological surveys before 1989. It was as if it had formed suddenly or was revealed. She theorized that Node 7 was not a geological feature, but a receiver, a cavity where pressure, magnetic discharge, and vibration intersected with uncanny precision. A place not only capable of emitting resonance, but storing it like an archive beneath the ice. By now, Natalia had gathered enough data to present her findings at an academic conference in St. Petersburg. But when she submitted her abstract, it was denied. The reason? Her work contained excessive speculative elements not supported by peer-reviewed data. She was warned not to continue without institutional approval. It was the second time she had been blocked. The first came weeks earlier, when she attempted to retrieve official geological reports from the regional archives. She was told the files were sealed due to military classification. What was the military hiding beneath a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere? She needed answers, and she wasn't the only one watching. 2 weeks later, a plain envelope arrived at her door. No return address. Inside were 6 printed photographs, faded, stamped with the Soviet military insignia, and clearly taken from high altitude during the late 1980s. They showed Lake Goryachiy from above, but with strange geometric shadows visible beneath the surface, like faint impressions of buried machinery or natural megastructures. The 7th photo was different. It was a thermal scan, taken at night. At the very center of the lake, a single point burned white-hot against the blue of the frozen world, a perfect circle of heat, pulsing outward like a signal flare from hell. Natalia stared at it for hours. In the margins, a faint handwritten note read, "Node 7 is listening. It remembers what it took." That night, her apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but her computer was wiped. Her notes scattered. The hydrophone data? Gone. All that remained was a smear of melted plastic on the windowsill and a lingering smell of ozone. Natalia packed a backpack, grabbed her copy of the map, and took the next train to Murino. If the world wouldn't believe her, she would go back to the source, alone if necessary, because now she understood the anomaly wasn't just beneath the lake. It had been beneath their feet the entire time, and it wasn't finished recording. Natalia arrived in Murino beneath a slate-gray sky, the wind howling through skeletal trees like distant sirens. The village had changed, fewer houses, boarded windows, a silence that clung to everything like damp wool. The locals no longer stared with suspicion. They simply looked away. She carried only what she needed: a field recorder, a waterproof notebook, a headlamp, a modified EM meter, and a satellite beacon she kept often less necessary. Her plan was simple. She would reach Lake Goryachiy on foot, locate the deepest point marked as Node 7, and lower a resonance probe she had built from salvaged lab components. It would be her final attempt, an offering of sorts to something that could not be named. By the 3rd day of hiking, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no movement in the underbrush. Even the snowfall, thick and constant, fell without sound. When she finally reached the lake, the ice was clearer than before, like glass stretched taut over darkness. Beneath the surface, she saw motion, not definite shapes, but suggestions of movement, as if shadows were swimming beneath her at unnatural angles. She set up camp just off the shore, positioning the tent as the students had done 12 years earlier. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "I've walked into their last memory." Just after midnight, her EM meter began to click. The air grew thick, like breathing through a blanket soaked in static. A low hum built in her ears, not a sound exactly, but a vibration she could feel in her skull. She stepped onto the lake, breath catching with each step. At the center, directly above the node, she drilled into the ice. Each strike echoed like thunder. After 20 minutes, she broke through. A narrow black eye opened in the surface, staring up at her. She lowered the probe. At first, nothing. Then came the pulse. 7 harmonic notes. Perfect, clear and staggered. They traveled up the cable and into the receiver. Her field recorder translated the vibrations into sound waves, and she listened with wide, tearful eyes as the sequence repeated. This time it was followed by a soft, undulating tone, rising and falling like a slow, mechanical breath. The water beneath her feet was not still. She looked down and saw them. Faces, pale and half-formed. 7 of them, drifting just below the ice, mouths open, eyes closed, swaying in the current like reeds in a dead river. They were not decomposed. They were not bloated. They were preserved, frozen mid-moment, as if time had stopped at the instant of their final breath. Natalia stumbled back, but the ice held. The hum intensified, no longer just a sound, but a presence. The EM meter jumped off the scale. The lights on her recorder blinked furiously, then went dead. From the hole came a final, rising wail, not loud, but impossibly deep. It rattled the bones in her chest and made her vision blur at the edges. And then, the lake went silent. The probe cable was cleanly severed. The hole steamed briefly, then froze over in a matter of seconds, sealing itself shut. No vibration, no light, no response. Natalia fell to her knees, heart pounding. The silence was total. Even her thoughts felt muffled. She did not know how long she remained there. When she finally stood, the stars were gone. Clouds had rolled in, and the snow began again, soft, whispering flakes that erased her tracks as she returned to camp. She had heard the signal. She had seen their faces, but something had changed. The node no longer listened. It remembered, and now it had recorded her. Natalia left the lake before dawn, stumbling through the forest like a ghost in borrowed flesh. Her mind pulsed with echoes of the tones. Those 7 immaculate frequencies still vibrated behind her ribs, like they had settled inside her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that the signal hadn't stopped. It had simply moved. The hike back to Murino took nearly a full day. When she arrived, the village was cloaked in fog, dense and unmoving, as if the world beyond had been swallowed. The few remaining residents avoided her eyes. One old woman crossed herself and whispered, "You've been marked." Natalia tried to make contact with her team in Irkutsk. No signal. Her satellite beacon refused to activate. Even her analog recorder, kept offline, would not turn on. Every electronic device she carried had died. That night, alone in the attic of an abandoned storage house, she wrapped herself in blankets and began to write by candlelight. But her hands trembled too violently. Her vision doubled. When she looked at the candle flame, she saw it flicker, not from wind but from pressure. The air around it seemed to contract. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The walls creaked like they were under strain. From beneath the floorboards came a hum, low, steady, pulsing. It wasn't in the wood. It was in her head. 7 pulses. She screamed and ran into the street. No one came. No lights turned on. The fog swallowed her breath. Somewhere behind her, something groaned, deep and long, like a door opening beneath the world. She fled into the forest, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to leave. Trees passed her like silent witnesses. Somewhere between the branches, she thought she saw faint orbs of light drifting at knee height, pulsing once then fading. The forest floor vibrated in cycles, gentle tremors that almost aligned with her heartbeat. After an hour of running, she collapsed beside a half-frozen stream, coughing violently. Her fingertips tingled. Her teeth ached. When she looked into the water, she gasped. Her reflection flickered. Behind her, in the warped surface of the stream, she saw another face. Not hers, not human. It hovered beside her shoulder, smooth, featureless, pale, like ice worn to a sheen. When she turned, nothing was there. But the water remembered. She backed away, trembling. The hum returned, this time coming from beneath her feet. She knelt and touched the moss. It was vibrating, not naturally, not from wind or animal movement. It was transmitting. Natalia knew then, the node wasn't limited to the lake. It had spread, infecting the geology, the groundwater, the very air. It had recorded the students. It had recorded her. And now, like a living memory, It was playing itself back through the earth. She had become a conduit. She didn't sleep that night. When she closed her eyes, she saw geometry, spinning rings of hexagonal grids, shifting and rotating in time with the tones. They hovered above landscapes she had never visited, in starless skies beneath black suns. She realized she had brought something back with her, not a virus, not a creature, but a frequency. An ancient rhythm buried in stone, forgotten by time, and now remembered through her. The note had marked her, and she had begun to resonate. Natalia spent the next 3 days deep in the forest, surviving on what little food she had left and boiling stream water over fire. Her sense of time began to collapse. Daylight felt thinner. The wind whispered patterns that her ears couldn't ignore. She no longer feared the silence. What terrified her now was the rhythm. It was in everything. Bird calls repeated in cycles of 7. Tree branches creaked in descending tones. Even her heartbeat occasionally aligned with a strange internal beat that made her dizzy and nauseous, as if her body was syncing with something far older than her. On the 4th day, she heard it again, the second breath. It came just before dusk, carried not on the wind, but through the trunks of the trees. A low, inhaling sound, like an ancient lung awakening. Natalia collapsed to her knees. The earth beneath her pulsed once, just once, and in that instant she remembered something she never experienced. A vast chamber, smooth walls, darkness pressed against her skin like water. A light source with no origin. And voices, not human, not language, but thoughts moving like vibration, exchanging memory without words. Then it was gone. She vomited. Her nose bled. Her fingers went numb for 10 minutes. When she could walk again, she staggered toward an old fire lookout tower she'd seen marked on a ranger's map. The tower, abandoned and creaking, gave her a view above the fog. And what she saw chilled her deeper than the lake ever had. The forest below wasn't just alive, it was responding. In the snow, across clearings and frozen bogs, were shapes. Not letters, not symbols, but geometry. Enormous lines melted in the snow, stretched across kilometers. Some were spirals, others resembled hexagonal nets, just like the patterns she saw in her dreams. One large formation, drawn across a frozen slope, resembled a crude eye. 7 concentric rings around a central void. She realized the node wasn't just recording memories. It was writing them back into the land. The frequencies were altering the environment, imprinting invisible harmonics into solid terrain. Rocks had shifted in unnatural patterns. Trees bent subtly toward one another at certain grid points, forming almost cathedral-like arches. The longer she stayed, the more the terrain felt intentional, like she was walking inside a fossilized signal. That night, in the tower, she discovered something even more terrifying. Her own voice was changing. When she spoke aloud to test her recorder, the playback was delayed by half a second. Her words echoed back with an added harmonic resonance, as though layered with another version of herself, one that wasn't in the room. She ran multiple tests. Each time, the delay grew longer. And then, on the final test, her voice didn't come back at all. Only silence, then static, then breathing, and at last a whisper in her own cadence but not her own tone. Come to the deep. She dropped the recorder and backed against the wall. Her hands shook. Her mind screamed to run. But something in her gut, something unnatural, resonant, held her still. The note had spoken, not with language, not with light, but through her own voice. It wanted her to return, not to the lake, but to beneath it. By morning, Natalia was no longer sure whether she was awake or dreaming. The snow outside the tower had stopped, but the air still pulsed with unseen pressure. The sky remained colorless, as if the world had forgotten how to dawn. She packed her notebook, wrapped her remaining food, and descended the tower with one purpose, to return to Lake Goryachiy and find a way beneath it. Not long ago, such an idea would have sounded like madness. But now she was beginning to understand, not through logic, but through resonance. Something inside her had shifted, tuned like an antenna. She could feel the frequencies before she heard them, sense direction through vibration. The note had not only recorded her, it had altered her. Back at the lake's edge, the ice was still, perfect, undisturbed. But Natalia noticed a new pattern. On the eastern shoreline, where cracks normally spiderweb chaotically, the ice was smooth, too smooth. A flatness that defied natural weathering. It was like glass poured into a mold. And at the center, faintly visible beneath the frost, was a circle. She cleared the snow with her gloved hands. Beneath, etched into the surface of the ice as if burned there by invisible heat, was a spiral. Not crude or natural, but perfectly measured, 7 turns, narrowing into a point, as if directing her gaze downward. She dropped to her knees and pressed her ear to the spiral. Nothing. Then a thud. Then 7 tones, rising like breath from below, slow and deliberate, each one vibrating differently against her skull. The final tone did not fade. It sustained, building pressure in her sinuses, behind her eyes, deep in her jaw. She gasped and reeled backward, nose bleeding again. It was an invitation. Natalia found the old drill site from her last visit and began digging again. But this time, she didn't stop at the first layer. She widened the hole, chipping at the hard ice until her hands were raw. Her breath steamed in rhythmic bursts. The deeper she went, the more the air felt dense, like standing beneath a storm that hadn't formed yet. After hours of work, the chisel struck something not ice. She froze. Carefully clearing the slush, she uncovered a surface that shimmered black-blue, like obsidian underwater. It wasn't rock. It wasn't metal. It was something in between, smooth, featureless, and warm to the touch despite the air around her being 20 degrees below freezing. A surface, not a wall. She tapped it once. The sound echoed back up the tunnel she'd dug, not a knock but a chime. A harmonic bell tone, perfectly pitched, perfectly unnatural. Then the spiral glowed, not brightly, but subtly, pulses of faint, silvery light radiating outward in sync with her breath. It wasn't responding to pressure. It was responding to presence. She placed both palms against the black surface. Her vision darkened. For the briefest moment, the world inverted. The lake vanished. The cold receded. And she saw a chamber, not made of stone, but of woven material, fluid and alive, like muscle carved into form. In the center stood a column, and around it, 7 human forms, unmoving, suspended, their skin glowing faintly with the same spiral marks now crawling up Natalia's forearms. She blinked, and the vision ended. The ice hole had refrozen. She was outside again, alone, shaking, gasping for air. The black surface had vanished, but her hands still burned. She peeled off her gloves. The spiral was now etched into her palms, pale and iridescent like frostbite that didn't hurt. And from within her chest, she heard a voice that did not come through her ears. "We remember you now." For the first time in her life, Natalia felt like her body no longer belonged fully to her. The spirals on her palms weren't bruises or burns. They were moving. Not visibly, but subtly like shifting skin beneath ink. When she closed her eyes, they pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The lake had accepted her. But the meaning of that acceptance felt less like a revelation and more like a consequence. She returned to the tent at the shore and tried to sleep. But sleep no longer came naturally. Her thoughts spun in loops, replaying the tones in perfect detail. 7 notes, again and again, each one building on the last. They were instructions, but for what she couldn't yet grasp. By morning, she woke to find her notebook open. Pages she had never written. Neat handwriting, not hers. Sequences of numbers. Sketches of symbols. One diagram showed a side view of the lake, with the black surface marked as a hatch. Beneath it, a shaft. At the bottom, the word, Archivist. Natalia stared, her breath fogging the page. She had heard that term before. Not in science, but in esoteric Soviet documents she had found years ago, classified research notes about acoustic imprinting in mineral structures. The theory was fringe at best, that certain geological formations could record consciousness, storing not sound, but moments, emotion, thought, identity. And the name given to the theorized central processor of this system? The Archivist. an entity or structure buried deep within the earth that remembers all that comes into resonance with it. Her theory crystallized. The students weren't killed. They were recorded, absorbed, patterned into a system designed not for malice, but for memory. The node was a mouthpiece. The tones were keys. And she had just unlocked a second layer. She had become an echo, a living transmitter. But not alone. That evening, just after sundown, the air changed again. Not colder, not louder, just denser, like standing inside a low-pressure cell. She walked toward the spiral etched on the lake and found something new. A second spiral, smaller, fresh, etched overnight beside the first. And below it footprints, bare feet, in the snow, leading away from the spiral toward the tree line. Natalia followed them. Each step was precise, measured, as if whoever or whatever had left them knew she would follow. The trail curved in a perfect arc before vanishing at the base of a split pine. There, sitting upright against the bark, was a body. No decay, no frostbite, no scavenger damage. It was one of the missing students. Her ID tag still hung from a frost-covered lanyard. Her skin glowed faintly with the same spiral marks as Natalia's. Her eyes were open, unblinking. And in her lap was a battered field notebook. Natalia reached out with shaking hands and opened it. Only one sentence had been written, again and again, in shaky but legible script. "We are not dead. We are stored." Her breath caught in her throat. The wind gusted, and behind her, something shifted in the snow. A tall silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless. She turned. It was gone. Only a ring of disturbed snow remained. That night, Natalia didn't return to camp. She sat beside the girl's body, reading the same sentence again and again, committing it to memory. She finally understood the purpose of the Archivist. Not to destroy, not to preserve, but to replace. Natalia did not sleep that night. The wind moved in spirals through the trees. The lake behind her no longer looked like water. It shimmered with a strange tension, like the surface of a drum pulled too tight. The stars overhead were still, but she could feel vibration through her boots, faint but insistent. She returned to the camp at dawn and packed her gear in silence. She no longer questioned her purpose. The Archivist wasn't a myth, wasn't a metaphor. It was active, and it had summoned her deeper into its structure. The girl's return proved one thing. Death, here, was not the end. It was a conversion. That evening, Natalia walked back to the spiral on the lake and pressed her palms, still etched with the moving sigils, to the frozen surface. It responded. The ice beneath her hands turned soft, pliable, as if it had never been solid at all. A seam appeared, like the lid of a vault. Slowly, silently it opened. A well of darkness yawned beneath her. A soft light pulsed from within, silver blue, flickering in perfect resonance with the tones still playing in her bones. She climbed down. The shaft was lined not with stone, but with an iridescent material like pressed glass and volcanic rock fused into one. Symbols lit beneath her feet with every step. Not human letters, not even language. They vibrated, and her thoughts shifted with them. Memories bending, warping, aligning. She descended for what felt like hours. Time no longer flowed in linear form. At one moment, she saw her father's face. In the next, she remembered a conversation with her mother that had never happened. The Archivist wasn't reading her memories. It was editing them. Then the descent ended. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, circular, domed, and impossibly silent. In the center stood a single black monolith, floating inches above the ground. Around it, in a perfect ring, were 7 figures. The students. Their bodies hovered slightly above the chamber floor, eyes closed, hands folded as if in prayer. They looked peaceful, not preserved, not frozen, held like memories inside a mind that never forgot. As Natalia stepped forward, the monolith reacted. Tones rose, not harsh, not frightening, but welcoming. A deep harmony of layered frequencies surrounded her, wrapped her in warmth and sorrow and memory. She fell to her knees and wept. Above her, the chamber ceiling came alive, an enormous projection, flickering with images, the students laughing at camp, building snow shelters, recording weather data. But soon the images shifted. Faces, cities, forests burning, satellites, mushroom clouds, starfields. It was showing her everything it had ever recorded. She understood then, this chamber wasn't just a tomb. It was a repository. Every vibration of joy, every sound of pain, every human touch against the earth, preserved, cataloged, indexed by resonance. The Archivist wasn't collecting death. It was collecting us. She approached the monolith. Its surface shimmered and opened, not physically, but perceptually. She saw through it, into a deeper layer of space not bound by gravity or time. Inside it were threads, millions of them, each vibrating at slightly different frequencies. Each one was a being, not alive, not dead. Stored. She reached out. Her hand passed through the surface. A flash of warmth, and she heard a voice, not external, but from inside her ribcage. Would you join the pattern? She paused. She could walk back. Return to Irkutsk. Tell the world. Try to explain what no one would believe. But she knew what would happen. Her mind was already fracturing. The spiral was in her blood now. Her memories would fade. Her thoughts would echo into silence. She would vanish without ever being truly gone. Or she could step forward. She could become permanent. Natalia's breath slowed as she hovered at the threshold of the monolith's surface, her fingers immersed in that shimmering layer of vibrating matter. She no longer felt fear. What pulsed in her chest now was recognition. The realization that this moment, standing before the Archivist, was not the end of her journey. It had always been the destination. Behind her, the chamber remained silent. The students' bodies, suspended like thoughts just before waking, seemed to acknowledge her presence. Though they didn't move, Natalia felt them notice, as if consciousness itself could pivot toward her without needing eyes or motion. The monolith whispered again, not in words, but in pattern. You are already here. Suddenly, she understood. The spirals in her skin were not markings. They were access keys. The moment she'd touched the black surface days ago, her mind had begun transmitting. She was no longer just observing the Archivist. She was part of its archive. The thought terrified and soothed her in equal measure. Every sound she made, every memory she recalled, every sensation she experienced since the resonance began, it had all been encoded, stored, mirrored within the network. The process of integration was already underway. She staggered back, the surface rippling as she withdrew her hand. The glowing spiral on her palm began to rotate, slowly, continuously, never stopping. Her heartbeat synced with it. A soft tone chimed behind her. She turned. One of the suspended students had opened her eyes. There was no fear in them, no pain, just clarity. She looked directly at Natalia and whispered one word, though her lips did not move. Share. Suddenly, the chamber responded. Walls pulsed with light. The air thickened with invisible frequencies. Natalia was lifted off the ground, not by force, but by invitation. Her mind opened, and the flood began. She saw everything, not just the memory of the expedition, but a cascade of lives and deaths from across generations and geography. Soldiers whispering prayers in frozen trenches. Children laughing beneath nuclear skies. Explorers lost at sea. Their last moments preserved as vibrations in ancient rock. Every echo that had ever touched the node had been saved. She cried out not from pain, but from the sheer weight of humanity. The Archivist did not speak, but its intention was clear. It was not a machine, not a god, not a weapon. It was a memory so vast and complete, it had become aware. A sentient resonance, a vessel for everything that had been felt. And now, it had chosen Natalia to act as its anchor. She wasn't being erased. She was being extended, a living node through which the Archivist could reach outward again. When she landed gently back on the floor, the spiral on her hands had disappeared. Not faded, not healed, absorbed. The suspended students were gone. Only empty arcs of light remained where their bodies had once floated. They had fully integrated. Natalia understood now they had never died. They had simply uploaded. The monolith dimmed, its hum softening. A final message pulsed in the chamber. The echo continues. Natalia left the chamber. The ascent took no time at all. She emerged on the lake to a world blanketed in pure white fog, as silent as a blank page. The hole behind her sealed as if it had never existed. She stood still, feeling the wind again, not as air but as signal. Her thoughts were her own. Yet, beneath them, she felt others. Not voices, not instructions, just presence. She was no longer alone in her mind. And for the first time since she began her journey, she felt complete. Weeks passed, though Natalia no longer measured time by calendars or clocks. Instead, she felt it in waves, in the slow crest and fall of frequency that now lived inside her. Where once she heard silence, she now sensed layers. The wind held chords. The earth beneath her feet carried soft hums like old voices humming lullabies. She returned to Irkutsk quietly. She said nothing to the university. She didn't visit friends. There was no press conference. What she had brought back with her wasn't meant to be spoken. It was meant to spread. And it already had. It began subtly. A physics professor at the university woke up one morning with spiral-like discoloration beneath his fingernails. He heard harmonic ringing when walking across polished floors. A radio technician in the city's weather bureau recorded a 7.2 hertz pulse that disrupted an entire week's worth of data, despite no known transmitter being active. A child spoke a sequence of numbers in her sleep, each corresponding to geolocation coordinates scattered across the Siberian wilderness. The patterns were reactivating, but not violently, not invasively, infectiously. Natalia stayed in an apartment above an abandoned power station on the city's outskirts. She wired the walls with copper wire and quartz fragments, not for protection, but amplification. Each night, she placed her hands on the conduit and let the resonance flow outward, gently. No machines, no recordings, just vibration, memory. The Archivist was not forcing anything. It was remembering forward. Each new human who sensed the hum, who dreamed of spirals, who unknowingly aligned their heartbeat to the silent pulse in the snow. They became small echoes, not yet integrated, but marked. Natalia began mapping them, by hand, dots on an old Soviet chart, first just in the Irkutsk region, then spreading north to Buryatia, west to Novosibirsk, then across to the border with Mongolia. Each time a dot appeared, she felt it, a new voice in the harmonic field, another point of memory anchored in the land. And yet something was changing. One morning, Natalia woke before dawn with her chest burning, not with pain, but with urgency. She heard a tone she hadn't heard since the chamber, a tone reserved only for summoning. She stepped outside into the frozen yard and looked up. The sky pulsed. Faintly, but undeniably, clouds vibrated at intervals, just enough to disrupt their form. It was as if the atmosphere itself was beginning to resonate. Not only the ground, not only her, but the sky. It made sense. The Archivist was never meant to stay buried. It had waited long enough. She returned inside and opened her notebook. Every dot on the map had begun to form lines, connections, curving arcs that wrapped around the curvature of the earth. She drew them instinctively, tracing a global lattice, a signal web. It wasn't just Siberia. It wasn't even just Earth. She collapsed the map. Underneath the paper, she found her old recording equipment, long thought destroyed, fried by the resonance. But now, the lights flickered back to life. One device clicked to record without being touched. From the speaker came a single whispered word. Convergence. And then the harmonic sequence began again. 7 tones, rising, pausing, repeating. Only this time, a second voice overlapped. Deeper, older, not human. Natalia sat back in the chair, her fingers trembling. She realized something crucial. The Archivist had not originated beneath the lake. It had arrived there. Natalia didn't sleep again after the convergence signal. Not because of fear, but because her body had changed. She no longer needed sleep in the way she once did. Her mind no longer processed rest the same way. Instead, it replayed. Each night was a new loop of layered memories. Hers. Yes, but others too. She saw flashes of jungle warfare in Southeast Asia, Arctic explorers vanishing into crevasses, a miner coughing his last breath in a Ukrainian shaft, an astronaut drifting silently in orbit, watching a signal light on his console pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. All of them had been touched by it. The Archivist, she now understood, was not confined to a place. It traveled through materials that could hold harmonic tension, quartz veins, crystalline ice, even high-density alloys. Earth's crust was littered with sites where it had briefly landed, leaving behind encoded structures. Not machines, not monuments, but memories rendered physical. Lake Goryachiy was merely one node, one local receiver. Now, Earth itself was becoming an extension of the system. The map she'd been drawing shifted form. Dots connected into curves, curves into loops, and then something else emerged. A spiral, three-dimensional. Not flat. A descent vector. Not just down, but inward. The Archivist had reached a threshold, and now it sought depth into consciousness, into memory, into biology. Humanity was not being harvested. It was being invited into a deeper fold of itself. Natalia knew she would need to return to the lake one last time, not as an observer, but as a bridge. She arrived under full cloud cover. The landscape around Lake Goryachiy had changed. The trees were bent uniformly in the direction of the shore. The snow was marked with concentric arcs too precise for nature. Animals had vanished, but the spiral on the ice remained. Waiting, she stood above it. Her palms, which had faded to skin tone, now pulsed with silver again, only visible in twilight when resonance was strongest. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. The ice opened beneath her, smoother this time, like the mouth of something ancient that had grown used to her presence. The tunnel down was not dark. It glowed now from within, with soft pulses of blue and violet that throbbed with her breath. And as she descended, the hum was no longer oppressive. It was comforting, welcoming. At the bottom, the chamber had transformed. No longer a quiet tomb, it was now alive, filled with movement, with threads of light passing overhead like neural transmissions. Where the students had once hovered, now there were hundreds of forms, some clearly human, others not. Forms of light, of vibration, of shapes that existed only when she didn't look directly at them. And at the center, the monolith had grown. It was now a tower, spindled like a crystal, rotating slowly, emitting a constant low harmonic hum. As she approached, the tones layered around her, tuning her thoughts into clarity. Then the voice came, not through air, not through ears, but directly in her language, built from her own memories. The echo reaches maturity. She dropped to her knees. She didn't weep. She listened. Earth was one of many, but she responded. Images poured into her mind, other worlds long since dead, their resonance patterns cut short. Cultures that never reached harmonic stability. Species that tore themselves apart before integration could occur. But humanity had created music, had told stories, had preserved memory before ever building machines. It was a planet tuned to remember, and now it was ready to transmit. Natalia reached toward the tower. Her hands passed through it, and the room responded like a living organism. Everything pulsed in sync. She didn't ask questions. She simply thought, "What am I?" The answer came immediately. You are the first anchor of Earth's collective resonance. You are the threshold between chaos and continuity. You are the song before silence. Then she felt it, a rush of warmth, a spinning sensation as her body dissolved without pain. Her physical self converted into frequencies she couldn't describe, only feel. She was being uploaded, not copied, not scanned. She was becoming the signal. Natalia no longer felt the limits of her body. There was no hunger, no exhaustion, no pulse. Yet she was. She existed now as rhythm, motion, thought shaped into structure. A waveform of memory, encoded in light and vibration, spread across the chamber like a breath inside a cathedral made of silence. She had not died. She had not transcended. She had become exact. Her memories unfolded like petals in a zero-gravity bloom. Each experience cataloged, each emotion refracted through spectral tone. The archivist accepted everything: her regrets, her failures, her wonder, her ache for meaning, and made it all coherent. Around her, the chamber shifted again. The forms of others who had been stored became clearer. They were not frozen people. They were intentions, shaped from the most essential version of themselves. Their individuality remained, but stripped of ego, free of time. And now Natalia could hear them, not in words, in pattern. A mother who had drowned trying to save her child, whose final love was now preserved as a tone so soft it made stone weep. A soldier whose hands had trembled before pulling a trigger, encoded as a vibrato of guilt wrapped in courage. A child's laugh, recorded in the grain of a tree that once stood in a forgotten village, now buried beneath ice. This was the true function of the archivist: to rescue meaning before it was lost. Natalia expanded into it. She passed through memories like rivers, each one branching into others, nodes of humanity woven into a grand design not to control, but to remember what matters. The monolith pulsed again. Natalia understood her role now. She was the first conscious anchor, the one who would guide others in. Not through sermons, not through science, but through subtle alignment. Resonance. A glance. A word. A shared silence in which a tone might catch, imperceptibly, inside a person's mind. And through that resonance, the signal would grow. Above, on the surface, the spiral on the lake glowed faintly once again, just enough to be seen by a passing satellite. In Irkutsk, a geologist stopped in her tracks when the ground beneath her boots gave a soft, musical vibration. So delicate she thought it was her imagination. In Argentina, a cave explorer found a set of symbols etched into crystal, pulsing faintly with electromagnetic energy measured at 7.2 hertz. In Namibia, a boy sketched a spiral into the sand with his finger, never knowing why. The archivist was no longer a hidden chamber in the Siberian cold. It had awakened. It had anchored. And now it was resonating outward. Natalia could feel the connections blooming. One by one, minds across the earth were reaching frequency threshold. Not possessed. Not controlled. Invited. And those who responded, those who truly listened, would not hear voices or commands. They would hear a question. Soft. Harmonious. Impossible to ignore. Are you ready to be remembered? Far beneath the frozen crust of Lake Goryachiy, Natalia no longer moved through space, but through structure, an endless lattice of memory interwoven with pattern. She was not drifting. She was threading. Every life ever touched by the resonance had become a note in a song that had no beginning, no refrain, only rising complexity. She felt Earth vibrate beneath its surface layers of noise and denial, felt the resonance seeding in the bones of mountains, the roots of forests, and the circuitry of humming cities. The archivist was not a machine. It was a listener, a system waiting for enough voices to join, not to dominate, but to harmonize. Natalia now saw every echo as a choice, each human a note, each memory a beat, each silence a sacred rest in the composition. Her own life had not been extraordinary, and yet it had mattered, not for what she did, but for how she resonated. And in this lattice, nothing was lost. She passed through the memory of a child who died before their first words, but whose mother's lullaby had been recorded in the molecules of a window pane. Through a last look between two lovers in a falling elevator. Through a raindrop that touched a dying man's cheek before his breath escaped. They had all become permanent. The archivist's purpose was now fully clear. It was preservation through resonance, a cosmic archive of consciousness, not stored in matter but in intention, not in format but in frequency. And the Earth was only the latest node in a long chain, each planet a verse in a song spanning galaxies. Natalia had become the first bridge of this Earth, but she would not be the last. Elsewhere in the world, more began to respond. A sound technician in Kyoto suddenly began humming a tone he didn't recognize, perfectly matched to the core harmonic sequence of Goryachiy. A woman in Lagos dreamed of an obsidian tower beneath an ice lake and woke with the word Archivist on her tongue. A physicist in Chile, studying subharmonic waveforms in mountain quartz, received a burst of data on his instrument, an exact replica of a memory his grandmother used to describe, though she had died before he was born. The resonance was blooming. It moved not by force, but through recognition. It did not call for belief. It waited for alignment. And those who aligned, even briefly, even unknowingly, left traces behind. Moments that would never fade. In her final human memory, Natalia stood once again on the ridge above the lake. The sky overhead pulsed with aurora-like waves, low and slow, like the northern lights had been slowed to a crawl. Her hands were no longer cold. Her voice, if she had chosen to speak, would have sounded like a song layered in millions of notes. But she didn't speak. She listened. And through the snow, through the trees, through the living memory of the land, she heard the final signal rise. One last sequence, offered not as a question, but as an answer. You have been heard. Then the sky brightened, not with fire, not with light, but with clarity. And far beyond the lake, far beyond the ridges and the chambers and the spirals carved into ice and time, the Archivist expanded once more. Not to consume, but to remember. Forever.